you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. And the presentation is going to look at, yes, what happens as technologies evolve over time, and based on that, what can we expect for AI? I worked with Gartner for nearly 30 years, tracking emerging technologies and looking at their trajectories. Before that, I was working in AI as well. We're just going to start out with a little pop quiz. There's a quote associated with a technology's launch, and that technology is, "What hath God wrought?" So I wonder if you have hands, because I can't see the room so well, but just think in your heads, which of these do you think this is associated with? The printing press in the 1400s, the telegraph in the 1800s, nuclear energy, 1951, the internet, 1983, social media around 1997. You have your guess. Well, clearly it could have applied to any of these, and personally, I think it should probably have been saved for social media, but it was, in fact, the first telegraph message sent in Morse code in 1884 from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. At the time, there were huge expectations for how the telegraph would reshape the world. There are wonderful quotes about how this invention would allow all the people of the world to come together and understand each other, and so they live in harmony and peace, which clearly didn't happen. In the mid to late 1990s, we heard the exact same euphoria around the internet, and publications like Wired said we were set for an unprecedented 25-year boom because of the particular nature of the internet network-connected technologies. And a few years later, in 2000, we had the dot-com crash. So we've seen this pattern play out over and over again. And in my early days at Gartner, we created a model called the hype cycle that captures that pattern based on watching technologies evolve over and over again. Some of you may be familiar with this. It starts out with an innovation trigger, which is a new capability or a product launch that makes the new capability enter into public awareness. And quite often following that, we see that peak of inflated expectations, like with the telegraph or the internet. We've seen it with social media, cryptocurrencies, and most recently with generative AI. What happens is that the technology sometimes mostly doesn't live up to those early expectations quite as soon as we thought it would. And we move into a trough of disillusionment, or maybe some people have tried it and they didn't get the value. But the lack of value is often a timing issue. And over time, the technology improves, it matures, you get methodologies, and more people start finding the value until we reach the plateau of productivity, where the value and the best practices to get you there are well understood. Julian asked me to share the origin story of the hype cycle. So for those of you who like a good origin story, the first hype cycle came out in 1995, and the names of the phases I owe to my headmistress of my secondary school, Miss Mackey, who in our English class as 11-year-olds made us read a very incomprehensible book called The Pilgrim's Progress by Paul Bunyan, which I remember very little about, except that they passed through places with names like the Slough of Despond. So clearly I was channeling that when I came up with the peak of inflated expectations and trough of disillusionment and so on. So a little fun fact there. We put some example technologies on the first hype cycle. We had knowledge-based systems. There's the information superhighway, if you remember that notion. And virtual reality was there on its way into the trough. And I would say that virtual reality probably wins the award for the longest time. That's what, nearly 30 years now, the longest time in the trough, as it still hasn't reached the plateau of productivity. The following year, clients started asking me if I was going to update the hype cycle with new technologies, which seemed like a great idea. So I did, and it took off. Other analysts started using it to track their areas of technology. And by the time I left Gartner 2 years ago, The annual hype cycle special report that some of you may use and work with was a huge endeavor involving dozens and dozens of different hype cycles in different domains, hundreds of analysts, and often close to a couple of thousand individual technologies and trends that are being tracked and progressed year over year. The core message of the hype cycle is one of buyer beware. You don't invest just because capability is hyped and everybody seems to be doing it. You should probably take a look at it at that point if it's a huge juggernaut of a trend, because there's something there. But you want to make sure you're adopting early only on those things that are of value, and realize that there's additional risk in adopting early. So make sure, as you all do, that your processes support that experimentation approach to minimize the risks. For things that are of lesser value to you, it may be fine to leave them until later and let others learn the hard lessons, and then move in as you move up to maturity. There's another sweet spot after the trough, as the technology can still give a little bit of value at the slightly less leading edge, but still ahead of the mass of adoption. Likewise, if there is real value for you, don't abandon a capability just because it's in the trough or it's harder than it first seems. And there may be temptations in some cases in some areas of AI to do that. And those of you who know about the trough can play a really important role in your organizations to dampen the effect of the hype cycle. So minimize the peaks and the troughs, make sure that people are investing and are aware of the forces that may drive people to adopt inappropriately, and keep people grounded in where's the value, how do we design experiments to make sure that we're doing this right and we're driving towards the value. And of course, once you know about the hype cycle, you start seeing it in all kinds of places. I've seen third parties create hype cycles for trends, for academic disciplines. There were many for COVID lockdown, for politicians. And I've had, excuse me, more than one client tell me it applies perfectly to their personal relationships of that and then. So let's take a moment to dive a little deeper into the components of the hype cycle. The first part of the curve is created by those expectations, which go up and then drop off as we lose interest in the novelty. And this is a natural human reaction to novelty. We're attracted by it. It's interesting. The cycle part of the hype cycle is actually this part of it. We tend to cycle around that enthusiasm, disillusionment, and onto the next big thing. In the meantime, the second part of the curve, that second uptick, is typically driven by the maturity. So this is the classic S-curve of performance improvements in a new technology that moves slowly up over time, starts slow, speeds up, and then levels off. And it's the gap between that initial excitement and the ultimate maturity that results in the hype cycle pattern. When we think about our current peak of inflated expectations around AI, which has mostly involved generative AI and large language models, it's useful to put it in a broader perspective. One of the interesting things that happens as a technology evolves is that it splits into different sub-technologies, different approaches and applications, which may move at different speeds towards maturity. For example, on the very first hype cycle in 1995, we had a one entry for wireless communications. And that rapidly became its whole own hype cycle with lots of different protocols and ways to achieve it, different standards. And then it became multiple hype cycles, one that would focus on the technology, one would focus on applications, one would focus on wireless security, and so on. With AI, we can see what's happening as part of a very long hype cycle of the single thing called AI, starting in 1950s, 60s. And in that sense, AI could be viewed as moving into the plateau of productivity. It's become already an everyday tool that's used in so many consumer and business applications, from personalizing our viewing experiences online and social media, and to very high impact financial decisions, medical, and many of the applications that I'm sure your organizations use it for. At the same time, specific applications and approaches are continually getting launched and gaining tractions and moving through the hype cycle, kind of like a series of fractals, if you like, underneath the big hype cycle. And that's what we've been seeing with generative AI and LLMs. They've hit this peak, and in particular, them hitting the application to what we thought was uniquely human creativity, which is where a lot of the fuss has come from. So inevitably, those technologies are going to go through the trough, and that type of discourse has already started as we've moved from the grandiose pronouncements that you see at the peak. In this case, a lot of those pronouncements were doomsday scenarios that AI is going to come along and there's no need for humans anymore. It's going to be the end of humanity. Those kinds of ideas. But the trough, largely being driven by specific issues like, sometimes it seems to make stuff up, or it's stealing from human creativity without compensation, and what do we do about intellectual property, and those types of issues. So we've looked at the issues that tend to push technologies into the trough and sometimes keep them there for a long time, and they fall into 4 categories. The first is the pure performance of the technology. Does it work as well as I need it to work to deliver value? You don't need it to be perfect, but it needs to raise the bar from what's gone before. And ideally, you'd like to, if it's not perfect, you'd like to be able to predict where it's not perfect and under what circumstances it works well and where it doesn't. With AI, as the panel just touched on, a big issue is the quality of the data, how current it is, how unique, how generic. And that's where we're seeing some of the concerns that are moving into the trough about whether we're perpetuating the biases of humans, or in some cases in the news recently where we're overcompensating for those biases or otherwise missing the mark. So it's coming up with nonsensical results that aren't historically or scientifically plausible. With AI invention, particularly in the light of the Patent Office rulings in many places about the human primacy in patents, we also care about how the results can be interpreted and fully understood by humans. So maybe kind of black box reasoning isn't good enough. Often what holds something back is a lack of integration and infrastructure, which includes technology, commercial, legal infrastructure. A great example was the early days of digital music. I was living in the US, still am, and the Federal Communications Commission at that time, the technology worked well, but it was all on illegal sites. So the FCC was suing 9-year-olds and grandmas for illegally downloading music until Apple came along with iTunes. It didn't invent digital music, but it did create a safe and legal way for people to pay for and download music, and that's what drove to it really taking off and coming out of that trough. Sometimes it's about the pace that a technology is penetrating into its potential user base. It's important, if you want large-scale adoption, for a technology to be integrated with people's normal workflow. If they've got to go to a different place, then it tends to get adopted more slowly. For example, now we're seeing AI pop up in a Google search, and you're getting the AI answer to your search. That's going to mean way more people are going to use it than if they have to go and figure out a log on to a separate site or a separate app. Trust and explainability. Do you consistently trust the results? And part of that is understanding, yes, how it got there. The visibility of the value is a key factor in driving growth. Everett Rogers, who created the original adopter categories of innovator, early adopter, early and late mainstream, and laggards, Everett points out the importance of observability. Can you see others being successful with this technology? That's why conferences like this are great, so that people can see what each other's doing, where the success is. If it's something that's highly visible, like cell phone adoption, then that really pushes it along. You see people using it and having success with it. If it's deeply embedded in the guts of your business processes, then that may move a little slower. And then finally, of course, the payback. Nothing's going to move forward to widespread adoption until there's a motivation to develop a pressing problem, a big opportunity. There's looking at the feasibility, the cost, the testability, how much do you need to invest to make this real? Obviously, the higher the investment, the more resistance you're going to come across. And the impact, the final impact when it does work, and the time to getting that value. How soon will you start generating a return on investment over time? So let's take a dive into a couple of these topics that are particularly relevant for AI. First, we'll look at the legal and ethical frameworks, and then the motivation for goals, which touches on the human element that we've been talking about. So one of the things that I like to do outside of work is write fiction. And sometimes I submit a short story to a magazine. And for the past year or two, all of the submission guidelines have say something about whether they allow AI-generated stories. Mostly they don't. They want to protect humans, which is what we see as one of the major stances in approaching kind of legal ethical frameworks around AI. The patent policies we've seen so far are in this camp, and the approach is something like, we're not interested in stories for which the traditional elements of authorship were performed by AI or machine learning. We want stories written through the author's unique sensibilities and passions. So we want to protect that creativity. There's another camp which has a different attitude that I counter less often, but is out there, which you might describe as can't tell, don't care. It's all about the outcomes, and I don't care how you got there. And this is characterized by, we do not prohibit writers who use LLMs from submitting. We have no way of detecting generated text, which renders policies prohibiting it unenforceable and therefore pointless. They do go on to say that they want your best work, and hint that your work is likely to be, at this point, better than a text-generated story. In the long run, for better or worse, the history of technology regulation tends to move towards not policing things that end up impossible to police. So we may see more of this second attitude over time. Back at the beginning of the internet era, we did briefly see a law that said that the carriers, the phone, cable, and other companies were responsible for all the content that they carried over their wires, which was clearly impossible for them to police. So that didn't last so long. But you tend to get those back and forth of more restrictive towards less restrictive policies. So in the meantime, if you think the regulatory environment is hindering you, you do have some choices. First, you can obey those rules, which is what most of you here will do, as you are highly established companies and you have too much to lose if you just go out on your own and start going rogue. But you need to be aware that others, particularly startups with nothing to lose, may try to stretch those rules, work around them, even openly defy them, like Uber and Airbnb and companies like that did as they started out their businesses. It's also worth noting that you tend to be the ones in the position to discuss options for the next generation of regulations. So many of you may already be involved in that. But discussions here, other forums, you're the ones with the insights as to what works, what is realistic, what's helpful, what's fair, and using those insights to guide the future regulations. So it's possible to be active on those things. The second thing, the critical issue I want to spend a moment on, is the importance of goal formulation. And this hits the point that Paul and others have made in the panel about the role of humans in all of this and how we balance the technology with the human element. Increasingly, AI is able to optimize whatever goal or task we set it to do, but what will remain uniquely human, I would argue forever, is deciding what is a worthy goal. You can get some of that from analyzing customer experiences, but what are you trying to have your customers do? Be healthier, be happier? Which do you prepared to do things that make them temporarily happy, but maybe not so great for them in the long term. So those kinds of ethical, moral, human decisions are basically arbitrary. So that's the part that humans are going to keep doing. It's based on personality, culture, time, and many other contexts. And even if everybody does agree on a high level goal, like we want to maximize world happiness. Some might debate that. No, it's not just happiness, it's actually purpose, or if it's some other factor. But even if, say, we can agree that maximizing world happiness is a great goal, the specifics of how you measure that is, again, somewhat arbitrary. So are you going to say, well, we want the largest sum of all happiness if we add all the human happiness together? Or should it be that we want nobody below a certain level of happiness, like a poverty level that we want everybody above? Do we want to add everything together and have the highest average? Do we want happiness growth rate, the gross national happiness? Do we want the smallest gap between the most happy person and the least happy person? We really care about the equity of that. Or did we not formulate our goal very well? And we look and we say, well, you're talking about world happiness. And we start to move towards those dystopian visions that people were having around, well, actually, we didn't mention humans, and all the other organisms and life forms that we share the world with would be very, very happy if humans didn't exist at all. So that's what we're gonna try and optimize. So deciding what is an appropriate goal is moving into this domain of ethics and philosophy. But that type of thinking is going to be increasingly important as AI becomes more capable. What is it that we're going to be asking it to do? What do we want to be optimized? Final observation, based on analyzing hype in the technology field for several decades. We've talked about the massive expectations that we have for technology when it first hits, but it's become clear that even when a technology meets or even exceeds those expectations, the user reactions to it become one of rather prosaic acceptance as opposed to wonder. Think of the amazing vehicle technologies we just take for granted. So power-assisted braking and sensors that tell you when you're drifting over the line, self-parking, and autonomous vehicles. When I came out of university, I worked in natural language processing and speech recognition. And if you told me I'd have a device the size of a tin of tuna sitting in my kitchen, and it could answer any question in the whole world in natural speech, I would have been totally blown away. But I'm not particularly blown away anymore. I just ask it what's the weather and how to convert cups to ounces to grams and very mundane requests. Clearly, the importance of what you do as inventors and enablers, IP experts and other enablers of innovation won't diminish, but you should assume that the way you and those who come after you use the tools that today seem absolutely amazing are just going to be part of business as usual. So I'll leave you with some recommendations. Remember the lesson of the hype cycle is to adopt because of the value, not the hype. Make sure you know where this applies. You use those insights carefully. And watch for the maturing infrastructure and the lower barriers to adoption that mark the move into a broader level of adoption, which may indicate some lower prices, some better maturity, a high likelihood of success in adopting the technology. Balance the human and computer contributions. Think about the goals that humans will need to do. Also, we heard about the quality selection of generated ideas. So that's going to be a major theme in both the ethical and the practical frameworks around AI, and in particular, put your humans to use in finding and defining those worthwhile goals at every level of specificity. You're going to need to include, ethicists, IP lawyers, and behavioral scientists to understand the human responses to technology. And I just want to leave you with a couple of my favorite book recommendations, books. Firstly, Everett Rogers, Diffusions of Innovation, about how ideas spread. Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, which has great examples of bringing change into an organization and how to do that well. Thinking Fast and Slow, the Bible of Behavioral Science, by Nobel winner Kahneman. And Creativity Inc., which I'm sure many of you have come across, which I just love as a wonderful example of how to create a culture and keep it creative over time, even as the company grows. And then also the Hype Cycle book that we pulled some of this material on from. I've also snuck in a plug for my novel written under the pen name J.A. Knight, gone viral, about a super smart programmer who creates a weapon of mass misinformation as revenge against a company who stole his work, but then finds he can't control what he's unleashed. So maybe one for the ride home. Thank you for your attention. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions.
Yes, questions.
Stop sharing.
Any questions?
No?
Yeah, sorry, Nick, please.
Do you think this hype cycle has changed very much in the last 20 years, or is it pretty much as it always has been? Do you think people have learned about hype?
I don't think so. I even have to remind myself about it sometimes. I think it's one of those things that it's because it is that human effect of the forces of adoption and attraction to novelty, and a certain extent not wanting to be left out. If everybody else is doing it, it must be good. So I think those forces are still there. What we do see is where a lot of the technology over the last 20 years has hit from the consumer side versus B2B type sales. The consumer hype cycles can move a lot faster, and the dip tends to be not as big. It's usually there. So the World Wide Wait, when that came out, and worries about social media and what it's how it's damaging our teenagers. So the trough is there, but it tends to be shallower, and the adoption takes off much more rapidly. Some of those elements we saw in the those 4 categories of things that keep it in the trough are associated with business adoption and the value and the higher cost of investment of many of the technologies.
And is there a sort of synchronization between multiple hype cycles and the business cycle? Because the business cycle is a kind of hype cycle, isn't it? Of some development, like the internet bubble or the tulip mania. It's all.
It's cutting out a little bit.
Is there a relationship between the kind of hype cycle of multiple things and the business cycle? I mean,
you're talking about if the things you're adopting are at different phases in the hype cycle.
Well, so the business cycle where people kind of massively overinvest and then
got it. Yeah. Oh, I got you. Yeah.
Is that in some sense related to these hype cycles? Are they fairly independent?
No, they are absolutely related, and we have examples in the book. We looked at the early days of Amazon and the IPOs in particular. Many of them follow that hype cycle. One point though, that plateau, we draw it as a kind of dampened curve that ends up at the midpoint. In some cases, that plateau is much lower. It doesn't get ends up being a niche technology. In some cases, it's way higher than anybody ever first thought of, and that with the financial and the business cycles, you tend to get the early effect, but then it over time, it's growing up, and there may be other little hiccups associated with the financial markets, but particularly in early investments like, now with Gen AI, yeah, we would expect to see the business market taking that hype cycle. And actually one of my colleagues in 1999 at the peak of the internet hype, he put out a hype cycle that predicted to the year the internet bust. So that's fairly predictable.
Right. Thank you very much. We now
Thank you for having me.